The restaurant came alive every evening, glowing with warm golden lights that reflected softly off polished glass and shining cutlery. It was the kind of place where people spoke in calm voices, where laughter was controlled and quiet, and where every detail mattered. From the neatly arranged tables to the gentle music playing in the background, everything was designed to feel perfect. Guests arrived dressed in their finest clothes, carrying confidence and comfort as if it belonged to them. Among the staff moving carefully between tables, there was a young woman who worked quietly, almost blending into the background. She had been working there for months, maybe longer, yet most guests never really noticed her. She carried trays, poured water, and cleared plates with a soft focus, never drawing attention to herself. Her movements were smooth and practiced, and she always made sure not to interrupt conversations or disturb the calm atmosphere. She didn't speak much unless necessary. When she did, her voice was gentle and respectful. Some of the regular guests recognized her face but didn't know anything about her. To them, she was just part of the service, like the music, the lighting, or the furniture. Someone who existed only to make their evening more comfortable. In the far corner of the restaurant stood a grand piano. It was elegant, black, and polished to a mirror shine. It wasn't played every night, but when it was, it added something special to the air. The sound would drift across the room, soft at first, then filling every corner with emotion. Guests often paused their conversations just to listen for a moment before returning to their meals. The young woman had noticed the piano from her very first day. While others passed by it without a second thought, she would sometimes slow down just a little when walking near it. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to feel its presence. There was something about it that pulled her attention, something familiar and distant at the same time. But she never touched it. She knew her place. She was there to work, not to dream. That evening, the restaurant was busier than usual. A group of well-dressed guests had gathered near the center tables, their voices slightly louder than the rest. They seemed relaxed, enjoying themselves, occasionally laughing in a way that made nearby tables glance over. They were regulars, the kind who felt at home in the place. The young woman was assigned to their table. She approached them with her usual calm expression, taking orders and serving drinks without interrupting their conversations. As she moved around the table, she could feel their energy, confident, comfortable, slightly playful. One of them noticed how quiet she was, how she seemed to avoid eye contact just a little more than usual. When she returned with their food, placing each plate carefully in front of them, one of the guests leaned back in his chair and watched her for a moment. "You look like someone who has a story," he said casually, not in a serious tone, more like a passing comment. She paused for a second, unsure how to respond. Then she gave a small polite smile, the kind she always gave, and said nothing. The others at the table chuckled lightly. "Maybe she's hiding a secret talent," another one added, half joking. The young woman felt a small wave of discomfort but kept her expression steady. She had learned how to handle moments like this. Stay calm, stay polite, don't get involved. But the conversation didn't end there. One of them glanced toward the piano in the corner, then back at her. "Can you play?" he asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. For a moment, she didn't understand what he meant. Then her eyes followed his gaze to the piano. Her heart skipped slightly. She quickly shook her head, almost immediately. "No," she said softly. It wasn't a loud or strong answer. It was quiet, almost like she wanted the question to disappear as quickly as possible. But instead, it had the opposite effect. "Come on," another guest said, smiling. "Just a simple tune. Nothing serious." A few people at nearby tables began to notice the exchange. It wasn't loud enough to disturb the whole room, but it was enough to create a small circle of attention. The young woman felt it, that feeling of being watched. She held onto the tray in her hands a little tighter. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I have work to do." She turned slightly, hoping to leave, but one of the guests spoke again. "It'll just take a minute," he said, still in a friendly tone, but now there was a hint of insistence. The manager, who had been observing from a distance, stepped a little closer. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he could sense the shift in attention. In a place like this, anything unusual could either become a problem or an opportunity. The guests were smiling, clearly not trying to cause trouble. They seemed entertained, curious. The young woman stood still for a moment, caught between what she was supposed to do and what she was being asked to do. Her eyes drifted once again toward the piano. Something inside her stirred. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper. Something she had kept quiet for a long time. "I really can't," she said again, her voice even softer this time. But now, even she could hear the hesitation in her own words. The room around her seemed to slow down, as if waiting for something. The guests exchanged glances, amused but also intrigued. There was something about her reaction that didn't feel like a simple refusal. Felt like she was holding something back. And that made them more curious. "Just try," one of them said gently. "We won't judge." It was meant to be reassuring, but it only made her more aware of the situation. Because being judged wasn't the only thing she was worried about. She lowered her gaze, thinking for a moment. The manager stepped forward slightly, his tone calm. "If you're comfortable," he said. Just a short one. It wasn't a command. It was more like permission. And somehow that made it harder to say no. The young woman took a slow breath. Her hands, which had been steady all evening, now felt slightly unsteady. She placed the tray down on a nearby surface, carefully, as if delaying the moment. For a second, she closed her eyes. Then she opened them again. "I'll try," she said quietly. The words were barely above a whisper, but they changed everything. The guests smiled, leaning back in their chairs, clearly interested now. A few more people in the restaurant turned their attention toward the corner where the piano stood. The young woman began to walk. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the distance, but because of what it meant. It had been a long time since she had walked toward something like this. The closer she got, the quieter the room seemed to become. She reached the piano and stopped. For a moment she didn't move. She just stood there, looking at it. The polished surface reflected the soft lights above, and for a second, she could see her own reflection staring back at her. Felt strange. Familiar yet distant. Slowly, she reached out and touched the edge of the piano, her fingers resting lightly against it. A small breath escaped her lips. Then, with quiet hesitation, she pulled out the bench and sat down. The room was now completely still. Even the background music had faded into silence. All eyes were on her. She placed her hands gently on her lap, staring at the keys in front of her. For a few seconds, she didn't move. It was as if time had paused, waiting for her to decide. Then, slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them on the piano keys. Her fingers hovered there, not pressing anything yet, just resting, just remembering. And in that quiet moment, something inside her began to wake up again. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but she didn't press them. The silence in the room grew deeper, almost heavy. People who had been talking moments ago were now completely still, watching her with quiet curiosity. Some leaned slightly forward in their chairs. Others held their glasses mid-air, forgetting to take a sip. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. It made her chest tighten just a little. She had not planned for this. She had not even imagined it. Just a few minutes ago, she was moving from table to table, doing what she always did, staying invisible in a place that wasn't really hers. And now, she was sitting in front of a piano, with a room full of strangers waiting for her to do something. Her hands felt unfamiliar on the keys, even though they had once known them so well. She took a slow breath. "Just something simple," someone from the table said softly, breaking the silence for a brief moment. The words reached her, but she didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the keys. Simple. Yes, that's what they expected. That's what she had agreed to. A simple tune, nothing more. She swallowed gently, trying to calm the nervous feeling building inside her. Her fingers shifted slightly, pressing down on one key, then another, testing the sound. The first note echoed softly through the room. It was clear, delicate, and almost fragile. A few people exchanged small smiles, as if to say, "This will be nice." She pressed another key, then another, forming a slow and familiar melody. It was something basic, something almost anyone could recognize. The kind of tune that didn't demand attention but quietly filled the background. At first, her playing matched exactly what everyone expected. Simple, careful, a little hesitant. Her fingers moved slowly, as if they were trying to remember the path. There were small pauses between notes, moments where it felt like she might stop completely. But she didn't. She kept going. The guests at the table watched with polite interest. One of them nodded slightly, appreciating the effort. Another leaned back, relaxed, clearly thinking this was just a light moment of entertainment. Around the room, the atmosphere softened again. Some people returned to their meals, though their attention still drifted toward the piano. It seemed like the moment might pass quietly, like a small interruption that would soon be forgotten. But something inside her was changing. With each note, her fingers began to feel less stiff. The distance between her and the piano started to fade. The sound, the touch, the rhythm. It all began to come back to her, slowly but surely. She took another breath, this one deeper than before. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. The melody continued, still simple, still gentle, but now there was a slight difference. It flowed more smoothly. The pauses became shorter. The notes connected with each other more naturally. She wasn't just pressing keys anymore. She was beginning to feel them. One of the guests tilted his head slightly, noticing the change. "Not bad," he murmured quietly. But she didn't hear him. Or maybe she did, but it didn't matter anymore. Her focus had shifted completely. The room, the people, the attention, it all started to fade into the background. In its place, there was only the piano, the sound, and something deep within her that had been silent for a long time. Her fingers moved a little faster now. Not dramatically, not enough to surprise anyone yet, but enough to show that she was becoming more comfortable. The melody grew slightly richer. There was a softness to it, but also a quiet confidence beginning to form. A few more people looked up again, sensing that something was different. The manager, who had been standing near the side, crossed his arms and watched more closely now. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to focused attention. This was no longer just a simple favor for a group of guests. Something was happening. At the piano, she closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not completely, just enough to disconnect from the room. And in that small moment, her fingers moved without hesitation. The melody changed. It was still based on the simple tune she had started with, but now it carried a different feeling. There was more depth, more emotion hidden between the notes. It was no longer something you heard in the background. It was something you began to listen to. The guests who had first encouraged her sat a little straighter in their chairs. One of them stopped smiling. Not because it wasn't good, but because it was becoming something they hadn't expected. She continued playing, her movements smoother now, more natural. The hesitation that had been there at the beginning was slowly disappearing. In its place, there was something steady, something real. Her hands moved across the keys with more purpose. The melody rose slightly, then softened again, like a quiet conversation. People who had returned to their meals now paused once more. A fork rested against a plate, forgotten. A glass stayed untouched on the table. The room was listening again. But this time it wasn't out of curiosity. It was something else. Something closer to interest. At the piano, she no longer looked nervous. Her face was calm, focused. There was a quiet emotion in her expression. Something that didn't belong to the room or the moment. Came from somewhere deeper, somewhere personal. Her fingers pressed the keys with more confidence now, no longer testing but knowing. The simple tune was still there, but it had grown. It had changed, and so had she. One of the guests leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her hands. "Wait," he whispered almost to himself, because now it was clear. This was not just someone trying to play a tune. This was someone who understood it, who felt it, who had done this before. The sound filled the room more fully now, reaching every corner without being loud. It carried a quiet strength, something that held people in place without forcing them. Even the staff had started to notice. A few of them stood at a distance, watching, their usual tasks momentarily forgotten. No one spoke. No one wanted to interrupt whatever was unfolding. And still she played. Each note came more naturally than the last, as if something long hidden was slowly finding its way back to the surface. She didn't rush. She didn't try to impress. She simply continued, letting the music grow in its own way. And without anyone realizing it, the expectation in the room began to shift. What had started as a simple request was no longer simple. What had started as a quiet moment was becoming something more. And though no one said it out loud, they could all feel it. This was just the beginning of something they hadn't seen coming. The melody continued, but now it no longer felt like something small or ordinary. It had grown into something fuller, something that carried weight without being loud. The sound moved through the room gently, but it held people in place in a way that was hard to explain. She didn't notice the change around her. Or maybe she did, but it didn't matter anymore. Her focus was completely on the piano. Her fingers moved with more certainty now, gliding from one note to the next without hesitation. The simple tune she had started with was still there, but it had been shaped into something deeper. There were soft variations, small changes that made it feel alive. She wasn't just playing anymore. She was expressing something. Her shoulders, which had been slightly tense before, were now relaxed. Her breathing had slowed. The nervous energy that once filled her had been replaced with a quiet calm. For the people watching, the shift was impossible to ignore. At the table where it had all begun, the guests were no longer smiling in amusement. Their expressions had changed. There was focus now and something close to surprise. One of them leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, eyes fixed on her hands as they moved across the keys. Another guest, who had been casually sipping a drink earlier, had now placed the glass down completely. His attention didn't leave the piano. "This isn't normal," someone whispered under their breath. And it wasn't, because what they were hearing no longer matched the idea they had formed just minutes ago. The room felt different. The quiet was no longer casual. It was intentional. People weren't silent because they were waiting. They were silent because they didn't want to miss anything. At the piano, she let her fingers move a little faster. Not rushed, not forced, just more confident. The melody began to rise, becoming slightly more complex. Notes layered over each other, creating a richer sound. It wasn't overwhelming, but it carried a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. Her left hand added depth, supporting the melody in a way that made it feel stronger. Her right hand moved freely, shaping the tune into something expressive and emotional. Her face remained calm, but there was something else there now, something deeper. It was as if she had stepped into a space that only she could feel, a place where the outside world no longer mattered. And in that space, she was no longer a waitress. She was something else entirely. The manager, still standing at a distance, straightened slightly. His eyes narrowed, not in doubt, but in realization. He had seen many performances in that restaurant, some planned, some unexpected. But this felt different. This felt real. There was no show, no attempt to impress. Just pure, honest playing. A couple seated near the window exchanged glances, both silently acknowledging that what they were hearing was far beyond what they had expected. One of them slowly turned their chair to face the piano more directly. At another table, a group that had been in the middle of a conversation had completely stopped talking. Their plates sat untouched as they listened. The sound filled the space, soft but powerful, like a quiet story being told without words. At the center of it all, she continued playing. Her fingers moved faster now, not wildly, but with purpose. Each note seemed to lead naturally into the next. There were no awkward pauses anymore, no signs of hesitation. Only flow, only connection. The simple tune had transformed almost completely. If someone had just walked into the room at that moment, they would have never guessed how it had started. Because now it felt like a performance. Not a planned one. Not a practice show for an audience. But something genuine, something unfolding in real time. Her hands moved across the keys with ease, reaching further, exploring more of the piano. The sound grew slightly stronger, then softened again, creating a rhythm that pulled the listeners in. It was not about being loud. It was about being felt. One of the guests at the original table slowly shook his head, almost in disbelief. "I didn't expect this," he said quietly. No one responded, but they didn't need to. Everyone felt the same. At the piano, she opened her eyes briefly. For a moment, she saw the room. The stillness, the attention, the silence could have made her nervous again, could have broken her focus. But it didn't. Instead, something else happened. She allowed herself to feel it. Not the pressure, not the expectation, but the connection. The fact that people were listening. Really listening. Her fingers pressed the keys with more strength now, not forcefully, but with confidence. The melody rose slightly, becoming more expressive. There was emotion in it now, something that reached beyond the notes themselves. Felt personal. Even though no words were spoken, it was as if she was sharing something hidden, something she had kept inside for a long time. The room remained completely still. Even the smallest sounds, like the clink of a glass or the shuffle of a chair, were gone. All that existed was the music. And her movements were no longer careful or uncertain. They were natural, fluid, alive. Each note carried intention, each transition smooth and effortless. The piano, which had once felt distant to her, now felt like a part of her again, as if it had been waiting, as if it had never really left. At one of the tables, a guest slowly leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it. Another person placed a hand lightly over their chest, feeling something they couldn't quite explain, because the music was no longer just sound. It was emotion. It was memory. It was something deeper than what they had expected from a simple request. At the piano, she let the melody soften for a moment. Her fingers slowed slightly, creating a gentle pause within the flow. It wasn't the end, but it felt like a breath, a moment to hold on to what had just been played. Then, without hesitation, she continued. And this time, there was no doubt left in the room. This was not an accident. This was not luck. This was skill. Real, undeniable skill. The kind that doesn't disappear even after time. The kind that stays hidden until the right moment brings it back to life. And as her hands moved across the keys once more, stronger and more certain than before, everyone watching realized something at the same time. They had only just begun to see what she was capable of. The music didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. What had already surprised the room was now turning into something even more powerful. The soft, emotional flow of the melody began to build into something deeper, something that carried quiet intensity. Her fingers moved with complete confidence now. There was no hesitation left. The piano no longer felt like something she had to think about, felt natural, like breathing. Every note came at the right moment, every movement smooth and controlled. It was as if her hands already knew what to do before she even thought about it. The melody rose higher, becoming more expressive, carried a feeling that was hard to describe, something between calm and strength. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it filled the room completely. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire restaurant had shifted into a single moment, held together by the sound of her playing. At the table where it had all started, the guests were completely still. The playful smiles they had earlier were gone. In their place was something much more serious: respect. One of them slowly leaned back, shaking his head again, this time not in disbelief, but in quiet admiration. "This is something else," he whispered. Another guest nodded, eyes still fixed on the piano. "She's not just good," he said softly. "She's trained." Across the room, others felt the same. The difference was clear now. This wasn't someone who had casually learned a few notes. This was someone who had spent time, effort, and heart on this. At the piano, she leaned slightly forward, fully connected to the music. Her expression remained calm, but there was a deeper emotion behind it now. Something personal. Something real. Her left hand carried a steady rhythm, grounding the piece, while her right hand moved freely, adding layers and detail. The sound became richer, more complex, yet still easy to follow. It pulled people in without effort. It made them feel something without asking. A couple sitting near the center of the room exchanged a quiet glance. One of them gave a small smile, not because it was pleasant, but because it was moving. At another table, someone slowly put their phone down, forgetting whatever they had been doing. Their full attention was now on her. Even the staff, who were usually busy with constant movement, had paused. A few stood near the side, watching quietly, careful not to interrupt the moment. The manager, who had once been unsure about allowing this, now stood completely still, his arms no longer crossed. His expression had softened. There was no doubt in his mind anymore. He was witnessing something rare. At the piano, she allowed the melody to rise further. Her fingers moved faster now, but not in a rushed way. It was controlled, precise. The notes flowed into each other smoothly, creating a sense of movement, like a story building towards something meaningful. The sound reached every corner of the room, not by force, but by presence. It filled the space naturally. There was a quiet power in it. For her, the world outside the piano had completely faded. She was no longer aware of the guests, the lights, or the room around her. She was somewhere else, somewhere familiar, a place she hadn't visited in a long time. Her hands moved with a kind of freedom that only comes from deep understanding. There was no fear of making a mistake, no hesitation about what came next. It all felt right. It all felt true. The melody shifted again, becoming softer for a brief moment, like a pause in a conversation. But even in that softness, there was strength. It held the room just as firmly as the louder parts. People leaned in slightly, as if not wanting to miss even the quietest note. Then, slowly, the music began to rise again. This time, it carried even more emotion. There was a sense of release in it, something that felt like it had been waiting to come out. Her fingers pressed the keys with just a bit more energy, giving the sound a fuller tone. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was strong enough to be felt deeply. At the original table, one of the guests let out a slow breath. "I can't believe we asked her to play like it was nothing," he said quietly. No one answered, because they all knew he was right. What had started as a casual request had turned into something unforgettable. At the piano, she continued without pause. The music now felt complete, like it had found its full form. Every note connected, every movement intentional. There was no longer any trace of the simple tune she had begun with. It had transformed entirely, and so had the way people saw her. She was no longer just a quiet waitress moving between tables. In that moment, she was the center of the room, the reason for the silence, the reason for the attention. Her playing reached a point where it felt full, rich, and deeply expressive. It wasn't about showing off or trying to impress. It was about something more honest, something that came from within. A few people in the room felt a quiet emotion they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't sadness, but it wasn't happiness either. It was something in between, something real. That's what made it powerful. At the piano, her hands began to slow slightly, not because she was losing energy, but because the piece itself was reaching a natural end. The intensity softened, the notes becoming more spaced out, more gentle. It felt like the closing of a story. Her fingers moved carefully now, placing each note with intention, letting it settle before moving to the next. The room remained completely still. No one wanted to break the moment. No one wanted to interrupt the ending. Finally, the last few notes echoed softly through the space. They lingered for a moment, then slowly faded into silence. Her hands rested lightly on the keys. She didn't move right away. For a second, it felt like time had stopped again. The room held its breath. And then, applause. Not loud at first, but real, genuine. It started from one table, then another, and quickly spread across the entire room. People stood up without even realizing it. The sound of clapping filled the space, breaking the silence but not the feeling. It wasn't just appreciation. It was respect. She slowly lifted her hands from the piano and looked up, For the first time since she had started, she truly saw the room again. And what she saw was completely different from before. People weren't just looking at her. They were recognizing her. And in that moment, everything had changed. The applause didn't stop quickly. It continued, strong and steady, filling the restaurant in a way that felt completely different from the music that had just ended. People weren't clapping out of politeness. They weren't doing it just because something unexpected had happened. They were doing it because they had felt something real. She remained seated at the piano for a few seconds, almost unsure of how to react. Her hands rested gently in her lap now, no longer moving, no longer creating sound. The silence she had once been comfortable with had returned, but this time it was surrounded by attention she wasn't used to. Slowly, she stood up. The applause grew louder for a moment, as if people wanted to make sure she understood how much they appreciated what she had just done. Some guests even rose from their seats, clapping with more energy, their expressions filled with admiration. She lowered her gaze slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of humility. She wasn't used to being seen like this. She had spent so much time being invisible that this sudden attention felt almost unreal. As she stepped away from the piano, a few people began to move closer. The guests who had first asked her to play were already standing, waiting for her. Their expressions had completely changed from earlier. There was no trace of casual humor or light teasing anymore. Only respect. "That was incredible," one of them said, his voice sincere. She gave a small, quiet smile. "Thank you," she replied softly. Another guest shook his head slightly, still amazed. "You said you couldn't play," he added. She paused for a moment, then answered honestly, "I said I shouldn't." There was a difference, and now they understood it. A few more people gathered around, asking gentle questions, not in a demanding way, but with genuine curiosity. "Where did you learn?" someone asked. "How long have you been playing?" another added. She hesitated at first, not because she didn't want to answer, but because she wasn't used to talking about it. That part of her life had been quiet for so long, almost like it belonged to someone else. But something about this moment felt safe. So she spoke. "I started when I was young," she said simply. "I practiced every day." Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet depth behind her words. "What happened?" one of the guests asked gently. It wasn't asked in a way that felt intrusive. It felt like they truly wanted to understand. She took a small breath before answering. "Life changed," she said. That was all at first. But the way she said it carried meaning. The group remained quiet, giving her space to continue if she wanted to. And after a moment, she did. "There were things I couldn't control," she added softly. "I had to stop." Her words were simple, but they held weight. There was no need for long explanations or detailed stories. Everyone listening could feel that it hadn't been an easy decision. The piano hadn't been something she lost interest in. It was something she had been forced to leave behind. "I thought I would come back to it someday," she continued, her voice steady. But days turned into months, and months turned into years. There was no sadness in her tone, just honesty. "And then," she said quietly, "it just became a memory." The people around her listened carefully, their expressions thoughtful. It was no longer just about the performance. Now it was about her, about the journey that had led her here. Working in a place like this, carrying trays, moving quietly between tables, while holding something so powerful inside her. It changed the way they saw her completely. One of the guests spoke again, his voice more serious now. "You didn't lose it," he said. "Not even a little." She looked at him for a moment, then gave a small, almost thoughtful smile. "I wasn't sure," she admitted, and that was the truth. Until that moment, she hadn't known if that part of her was still there. It had been hidden for so long that even she had started to doubt it. But now there was no doubt left. The manager approached them then, his presence calm but noticeable. "That was unexpected," he said, his tone carrying a hint of warmth. She straightened slightly, returning to her usual respectful posture. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to." He raised a hand gently, stopping her. No, he said. Don't apologize. There was a small pause. Then he added, that was something special. She didn't respond right away. Not because she didn't appreciate it, but because she didn't quite know how to accept it. For so long, her role had been clear. Do the work. Stay quiet. Don't stand out. And now everything felt different. One of the guests spoke again, this time with a thoughtful expression. Have you ever performed? He asked. She shook her head slowly. Not like this, she said. There had been moments in the past, small ones, but nothing like what had just happened. Nothing in front of people like this. Another guest leaned slightly closer, his tone more serious. You should, he said. You really should. She didn't answer immediately. The idea felt distant. Not impossible, but far away from the life she was currently living. I don't know, she said honestly. It wasn't doubt in her ability. It was uncertainty about everything else. But the conversation didn't end there. The people around her weren't just impressed, they were invested now. They had seen something real, something rare, and they didn't want it to disappear again. One of them spoke with quiet confidence. Sometimes, he said, all it takes is one moment to change direction. She listened, but didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she was still processing everything that had just happened. The applause, the attention, the questions. It was all new, all unexpected. But beneath it all, there was something else. Something steady. Something that hadn't been there before. A quiet sense of possibility. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to think about it. Not in a big, overwhelming way. Just a small thought. A small opening. The piano was no longer just a memory. And maybe it didn't have to stay that way. Around her, the room slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. People went back to their tables, conversations resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. There was something lingering in the air, something that wouldn't be forgotten easily. As she stepped back into her role, picking up her tray once again, everything looked the same on the outside. The same tables, the same lights, the same quiet movement. But inside, something had shifted. And even though nothing had officially changed yet, it felt like the beginning of something new. The rest of the evening didn't return to normal. No matter how much the restaurant tried to settle back into its usual rhythm. Something had changed and everyone could feel it. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. People still spoke, still laughed, but there was a new awareness in the air, like they had all witnessed something they didn't expect to experience that night. She moved between the tables again, carrying plates and refilling glasses just as she always did. On the outside, nothing about her actions had changed. She was still careful, still quiet, still focused on her work. But inside, everything felt different. Her hands, which had just moved so freely across the piano, now held a tray again. Yet the feeling of the keys hadn't left her. It stayed in her fingertips, like a memory that refused to fade. As she approached a table, one of the guests looked up at her with a soft smile. You were amazing, they said gently. She nodded slightly. Thank you. It was a simple exchange, but it happened again and again. Different guests, different tables, all sharing the same feeling. No one spoke loudly about it, no one made a scene, but the respect was clear. She was no longer invisible. At the center table, the group who had first asked her to play were still there. Their conversation had shifted completely. When she came near, they didn't treat her like staff anymore. They spoke to her like someone they genuinely valued. One of them leaned forward slightly. Can we talk to you for a moment? He asked. She hesitated, glancing briefly toward the manager, then nodded. Of course, she said quietly. She stepped closer to their table, holding the tray carefully at her side. The guest who had spoken earlier looked at her with a thoughtful expression. What you did tonight, he began. That wasn't something small. She didn't interrupt. I know you said life changed, he continued. But talent like that doesn't just disappear. It's still there. We all saw it. The others at the table nodded in agreement. She listened, her expression calm, but her mind was still catching up with everything that had happened. Another guest spoke, his tone steady. I have a friend who works with music programs, he said. They help people get back into training, into performing again. She blinked slightly, surprised. I'm not saying you have to decide anything now, he added quickly. But if you're willing, I could connect you. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Opportunities like that didn't just appear out of nowhere. And yet, here it was, right in front of her. She started, then paused. Her thoughts felt scattered. Not because she didn't understand, but because she hadn't allowed herself to imagine something like this in a long time. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted honestly. The guest gave a small, understanding nod. That's okay, he said. You don't have to be ready right now. Just don't close the door. Those words stayed with her. Don't close the door. She gave a small nod in return. Thank you, she said softly. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And that mattered. The manager approached again shortly after, his expression thoughtful but calm. When your shift ends, he said quietly, come see me. She looked at him, slightly unsure, but nodded. Yes. The rest of the evening passed slowly, yet quickly at the same time. She continued working, but her mind kept returning to the same moment. The feeling of sitting at the piano, the sound of the notes, the way the room had gone completely still. It didn't feel like something that had ended. It felt like something that had just begun. When her shift finally came to an end, the restaurant had started to empty. The lights were still warm, but softer now. The noise had faded into a quiet calm. She placed her tray down and took a slow breath before walking toward the manager's office. She knocked gently. Come in, came the response. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The manager looked at her for a moment, then gestured for her to sit. She remained standing at first out of habit. It's okay, he said gently. You can sit. She nodded and took a seat. There was a brief silence. Then he spoke. How long has it been? He asked. She knew what he meant. A few years, she answered. He nodded slowly. You didn't forget anything. She gave a small, thoughtful smile. It felt like I did, she said. But you didn't, he replied. There was no doubt in his voice. He leaned back slightly, considering his words carefully. You've been working here quietly, he continued, doing your job well, never asking for attention. She listened. But tonight, he said, you showed something else. She lowered her gaze slightly, unsure how to respond. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything about music, he added. But I know when something feels real. He paused, then continued. If you ever want to play again, we can arrange that. She looked up, surprised. Not as staff, he clarified. As someone people come to listen to. The words settled slowly in her mind. It wasn't a big promise. It wasn't a guaranteed future. But it was a door. Another one. She took a quiet breath. Thank you, she said. And this time her voice carried something new. Not just politeness. Something closer to hope. When she stepped outside the restaurant later that night, the air felt different. Cooler, calmer. The noise of the world beyond the doors was distant. Almost quiet compared to everything she had just experienced. She paused for a moment, looking up at the night sky. For so long, her life had followed a single path. Work, rest, repeat. Simple, predictable, safe. But now there was something else. A second path. Unclear, uncertain, but real. She thought about the piano, about the feeling of her hands on the keys, about the way the music had come back to her without warning. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't push the thought away. She let it stay. She let it grow. Because maybe that part of her life wasn't over. Maybe it had just been waiting for the right moment. And tonight, that moment had finally come. She took a slow breath, then began to walk. Not with the same quiet hesitation as before, but with something slightly different. Something stronger. Something that hadn't been there when the day began. A sense that her story wasn't finished. In fact, it felt like it was only just starting.